Hello there. Welcome back to the R.M.Williams Outback podcast, where we shine a light on all the absolutely fantastic things that are happening and the fantastic people away from the bright lights of our cities. We focus on the 3 R's of Australia. That's remote, rural and regional. We're just like the beautiful R.M. Williams Outback magazine, except for your ears. I'm Terri Cowley, one of the journalists on the magazine and also your podcast host. Settle in with us and you'll get to meet some really great people, and I don't mean me. Have a question? Find out more at outbackmag.com.au. Hollywood turned American author Zane Grey's best-selling Western novels into blockbuster films. But when the celebrity came to Australia twice in the 1930s to go big game fishing, he was adored like nowhere else on the planet. Writer Vicki Hastrich has written what's been described as a deeply perceptive portrait of Grey, the world's first millionaire author, who was also the inventor of the Western in both literature and film, and who was globally feted as a brave adventurer. Vicki's 2025 book is called The Last Days of Zane Grey, the untold story of a Hollywood legend in Australia and his hunt for the great white shark. Vicki has also written a story about Grey for issue 164 of Outback magazine, and she joins me now on the podcast. Hello, Vicki.
Hi, Terri. Lovely to be with you.
Now, what a fascinating story. Zane Grey, born 1872, died 1939, pioneer of the Western, wrote more than 80 books that sold millions of copies, loved his fishing. How did you first become interested in him?
Terri, it was just sort of a complete stroke out of the blue. I was kind of idly looking up the characteristics of the Western novel and immediately came across the name of Zane Grey. And I didn't know who he was, like so many people now. And so I further Googled Zane, only to discover that on, one of the first entries that came up for him on a Google search was for the Bermagui Caravan Park, which was named after Zane Grey. And from there, my curiosity just had to be sated. I had to find out. It didn't make any sense. I didn't know at that point that he was one of the pioneers of big game fishing, let alone that he'd come to Australia. And why on earth would he go down to the south coast of New South Wales to Bermagui? So that was the adventure that I was led on.
Okay, so your story starts with him camping at Bermagui in 1936. Can you tell me about that trip?
Yes, so this was him coming to fish unfished waters. He was always a man in search of a new frontier. That's what he'd written about with his Western novels that people around the world loved and Australians really adored. All those wide open spaces and strong, resilient country people, that spoke to Australian people. And so coming to Australia, here he was heading down to Bermagui because he'd heard reports that swordfish were swimming around in quite great numbers around the Bermagui, Narooma area, Montague Island. So he was ready to come on a hunch. He was also ready for a big adventure himself, and to make good, his finances were shaky, even though he was meant to be this multi-millionaire, one of the first in the world as an author. Things behind the scenes were shaky, I discovered. And so coming to Australia, he thought would not only find new stories, but there could be films to be made. And that's where he could really scoop in some big money. On top of that, he had a secret Australian lover, I discovered. So that was another draw card.
I bet. So big game fishing had become like a new glamour sport.
It really had. And only in, just 2 years before, the first marlin were caught on rod and reel around Montague Island. And it was a draw card for a lot of wealthy country people too, loved their game fishing. And then once it was apparent that these really mercurial creatures that Most people, they just hadn't been seen by people before. Here they were able to be caught. And once Zane Grey came down to that area, then, of course, all these beginner big game fishermen and women wanted to come and try their luck as well. So the Bermagui-Narooma area became a honeypot, and people from all around the country came to try their luck, the wealthy who could afford this new glamour sport.
Just taking a bit of a different tack now, and I think you did allude to it earlier. Why do you think Australians were such fans of Grey's Western stories?
Well, it was because they loved the feats of horsemanship, the adventure, and the landscapes. And Zane Grey really was one of the wonderful writers of landscape of his time. And he introduced Americans to these spaces that they didn't know much about in their country, because he was often one of the first white people to go into some of these areas, particularly the deserts of Utah and Arizona. And then also, at the same time as his first bestsellers were coming out, Hollywood came into existence, and they quickly latched onto his stories and turned them into films. So this was how Zane Grey went so global, and the reach came to Australia. We loved his novels, and they were passed around shearing sheds and kitchen tables and were a kind of social currency. Everybody knew the novels, but they also knew the films because there were many, many of them, and they were, I think at the time, 1936, when he arrived, I've calculated there were about 9 Zane Grey Western films in circulation around the country. And so they were not only in the big cities, but also, of course, right down to the little country towns that had one man, travelling picture show man showing the films, and they were dearly loved. And on top of that, the Zane Grey stories were romances, essentially. So women loved them too. And the women characters, the female characters, were strong, feisty types who were, tough in their environments. They could cope with these remote places. So Australians, when he arrived, it was like Beatlemania. The press hung on his every word and reported everything he did and said, right down to the most silly things. And people followed his progress through the newspapers. Thousands of people flocked down to Bermagui to get an autograph. He calculated that in the first 2 weeks of being there, he'd signed over 5,000 autographs, and people had travelled hundreds of miles to do that.
Wow. So his first trip lasted for 8 months.
It did. It did, because he fished in Bermagui first, shifted camp. He was rather overrun there by gawkers. He tried his best to be patient with everybody, but he shifted to Bateman's Bay. And there he started to become obsessed with this idea of matching himself up with a great white shark. And it was a shark he'd never caught before. He caught a small one there, but he glimpsed a monster-sized one under the boat one day, and that just captured his imagination. And so from Bateman's Bay, he shifted up to Sydney for a month, caught a world record tiger shark just off Sydney Heads there, went to the Royal Easter Show like so many country and Sydney people, and then he moved up to Hayman Island for several months to shoot the world's first Jaws movie, essentially. It was called White Death, an extraordinary piece of filmmaking when you think about it.
Mm. So he starred in it, and I think he was playing a man who was saving a village terrorised by a great white shark. So straight away my mind went to the Chief Brody character from Jaws.
Oh, totally. It was essentially the same sort of storyline. He starred as himself, the hero, come to save this village where several people had been taken by this marauding shark. And unfortunately, the filming of this movie was pretty disastrous from go to woe. All sorts of things went wrong. It was almost a comedy of errors. And Zane Grey was actually meant to catch the shark, the anti-hero shark. And that was one of his tasks as well as acting in the film. But it turned out that it was one of the worst fishing periods ever off Hayman Island, and only small ones could be found, which, a mix of them on the film just didn't look realistic or terrifying at all. And of course, in the end, they had to resort to a big fake shark, which is only shown in the film for about a second because it's so bad.
I love the quote that you include from the Workers' Weekly in your story about the film. The story is exceedingly weak and so is the acting. Only those with an interest in fishing should see it. Even they will be disappointed with the obvious fake shark at the end.
Yeah, so apparently it had galvanized iron teeth. So
Ah, dear.
it was a flop at the box office, I have to say, and so a huge embarrassment to Gray. But it didn't put him off wanting to come to Australia again.
No, it didn't.
He was rather mortified about the film and had plans to come back fairly immediately, but he did put it off for a little while.
And while he was away, he wrote a novel set in Australia.
He did. It was called The Wilderness Trek. And anything animal or environment that he had seen himself is really faithfully rendered. But unfortunately, where he writes about places that he'd never been, things go off the rails a bit. It follows a big trek from Queensland over across the country to the Kimberley. And of course, Zane Grey had only ever clung to the east coast of Australia, so knew nothing of the interior. And it features a couple of American cowboys come to Australia and leading this trek.
Would have had some comical elements for Australian readers, I would imagine.
Exactly. He was determined to come back, but there was a setback, and he suffered a stroke while he was fishing by an Oregon river. And he fought very hard to come back from that and regain his capacities. So when he returned in 1939, it was with this mission to catch a monster-sized great white shark. And he headed towards Port Lincoln in South Australia, where we know the waters there are host to many. But he was compromised. So this is the great story, really, that I uncovered in that, and his American biographers really hadn't understood this, that this was the story of a failing hero, really. Here he is pitting himself against the ultimate opponent, but he's vulnerable. And all his life he'd worried about, had moments of deep depression and worried about death looming. His younger brothers had died of heart failure, and he had felt this coming for him too, and having just suffered the stroke. Here he was going out to do battle in very much rougher boats and conditions than he'd been used to. So he did finally meet up with a huge great white.
What popped into my mind when you were saying that, man against beast, I suppose, was a few traces of almost like Moby Dick in there, isn't there?
There is. It is this facing up to this sort of, well, really, this figure of death, if you like, having to confront it.
While he was worried about his own mortality.
Yeah, man facing his fate, really. So in those seas, he had the epic encounter he'd been hoping for, and it had an unexpected outcome. But nevertheless, he was thrilled to have had this incredible experience.
Yes, and I mean, you've got to think about what the world was like then. It wasn't just like people could go onto the internet and look at videos of great white sharks. I mean, these would have been rare sightings indeed, wouldn't they?
Yes, this was the thing I really discovered during the writing of the book, that people really had no idea about the contents of our seas. And when I say people, I include marine scientists there, because I've gone into what marine science knew at the time of our fisheries, and it really wasn't very much. There was, at one point, one scientist responsible for looking into our fisheries, and he didn't even have a boat. So that was difficult. But I think this was part of the reason too why people were so fascinated and enamoured with Zane Grey's doings, because here he was bringing these incredible creatures up from the sea. And of course, with sharks, there was the growing beach culture that people were enjoying, but there'd been a series of pretty terrible shark attacks on Sydney and Queensland beaches. So people, wanted to see these fearful monsters, as they thought of them. But also, the underwater world was very much in the zeitgeist. It was the new frontier. Antarctica, a few decades before, had been the discovery everybody was interested in. Now it was the underwater world. There were 3 aquariums in Sydney as popular amusements for people to go to, and another couple elsewhere, Melbourne and Adelaide. And the first underwater footage had just been shot just in the late 1920s, and that was an Australian who did that, and that footage was shown around the world. So it was very much in people's minds, this mysterious realm. And then I guess by the time Zane Grey left Australia in 1939, just as World War II starting to loom over the top of everyone, then of course aviation becomes the next frontier.
By the stage that he came out for the second time, his health, well, you said his health was weakened because he actually died just 5 months later at home.
That's right. So it wasn't far away for him. And I think he genuinely had a sense of that when he was sailing over to Australia. He wrote to his wife, Dolly, and said that he'd stopped off in Hawaii, I think it was, and had walked into town and felt strange. And obviously, I think then there was something going on with his health. And so he was nervous, very nervous, and he could feel that things weren't right.
You say in your story that in some ways Grey helped change Australia.
Yes, he did, because, in several ways, really. He certainly put Australia on the map internationally as a game fishing destination, although, of course, the war intervened and so that was halted. But also, he importantly caught a big tuna when he was in Bermagui, and he caught it out of a vast school, of course, and alerted Australia to the fact that here these were dollars swimming by and food. Here we had an industry at our doorstep. And so that really generated the canning industry. From the moment he brought this to the public's attention, the one scientist I mentioned started looking into this situation, and within only a couple of years, the first canning companies were set up, first in Narooma and then Eden. That was a big industry in the end. And it was important for Australia's food security as the war was coming. We imported more fish than we caught, which seems incredible. And of course, from the Eden fishery, the Port Lincoln fishery grew, which is now, of course, this incredible multi-million-dollar industry. And on top of that, I think Zane Grey's visit is important to remind us that's only really a moment ago when we knew nothing much of our oceans and seas and the contents. In fact, my parents were children when Zane Grey was in Australia. And to think now that just that short time later, we have largely destroyed much of our ocean. They're not the pristine places, our seas, that they once were at all.
So Grey really liked Australians, it seems, and he interacted with people such as Miles Franklin and Charles Kingsford Smith.
He did. These were very fun discoveries to make. Miles Franklin wrote to Grey out of the blue, and it's a fantastic letter, the cheekiest sort of cold call you could ever make. He had praised a novel of hers, saying it was the best he'd read while he was in Australia, but it was written under her pseudonym of Brent of Bin Bin. That was a novel called Up the Country. And so she wrote to him saying, "Look, I've got a new novel out. That was me who wrote that. Would you please put my new novel in front of your publishers and see if I could get an American publisher?" Because Miles Franklin was sick of struggling on the way she'd been and wanted to crack it overseas. And Grey helped her, but privately he thought it was a bit of a queer and cheeky request and the tone of her letter. But they corresponded a little bit until, unfortunately, Grey had his stroke. And then, yes, he knew Charles Kingsford Smith, had met him on a passenger liner when Kingsford Smith was heading to America. Their boat called in at Tahiti, where Zane Grey was fishing in his millionaire fashion. So they travelled back to the States together. And this was when Charles Kingsford Smith was trying to mount his Trans-Pacific flight. And he was having trouble once he hit the States of getting things together and getting the money to do this. And Zane Grey helped put him in contact with a philanthropist who basically paid for the flight to be made, that historic flight. And Charles Kingsford Smith said to Grey, "Look, I'll take you up in the plane and in the Southern Cross." And Grey was actually terrified of flying and sort of fudged out of it. But he gave Charles Kingsford Smith a lucky rabbit's foot that had been given to him by a Navajo man. So in the end, I'm afraid the lucky rabbit's foot didn't do Charles Kingsford Smith much good. But it was a very interesting interaction they had.
I believe Zane Grey also told us a few home truths.
He did. On his last press conference before he left Australia, he dished out a few opinions, and the primary one that I take away is that he very firmly said, "You Australians don't respect your Aboriginal people as you should for their knowledge and intelligence." They are adjectives that very few people were using about Aboriginal people at the time. Respect, knowledge, intelligence. Grey always had respect for and an interest in Indigenous people from his own travels and interactions with Native Americans. And when he was here in Australia as well, in the South Coast, he interacted with the Yuin people. And then on Hayman Island, when they were shooting the film, Palm Island men had come to act in the film. Zane Grey had an entourage, so the whole party interacted very intimately, tried to learn language from the men, were interested in the songs and the music. So these were very genuine interactions that Grey formed his opinion from. So that was certainly one thing he was sure to lay down to us. He also said that he admired the Australian people because they were forward-thinking people and outgoing. So we copped some praise too.
So I think what you've described is a flawed hero, but you obviously do admire many traits about him. After doing this big deep dive on this man and his character and his adventures for your book, where did you land as into what your personal opinion was of this man, Vicki?
I think it's the fact that he is so complicated that's kept me interested and engaged. And also that so many interesting people coalesced around him too. You know, I've mentioned a few. So in a way, he was a vehicle for me to look at a lot of other things about Australia as well as him and things American. So that was appealing to me in following him. But Ultimately, I think he was an incredibly lonely man. Although he was always surrounded with people, as I say, he travelled with an entourage. But I think this was the key thing. And in his fishing, he could forget about that for a while in the concentration of being out in the water. And likewise, when he travelled to wilderness places in America, being in nature helped him forget for a moment, and experiencing the sublime lifted him out of himself. But he was liable to sink, and I do think he was at core lonely, despite having a loving marriage and many other lovers too along the way.
Perhaps chasing something he never quite found.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, as I said, you can read Vicki's story about Zane Grey in issue 164 of Outback magazine. There's some fantastic old pictures of him too, including one of him with the world record tiger shark and on location for the shooting of White Death. I don't know if you did your own photo research, Vicky, but you must have had fun trawling through all those old images.
Oh, yes. I did do my own photo research, and I have plenty of them tucked away, and archives were very generous in letting me reproduce, some of the ones I have there. But, there are many to choose from, but this is a great selection, I think.
All the best with the book, Vicky. I'm sure it'll be well received, and I'm sure your story about Zane Grey will be very well received by our readers as well, and that some of them will maybe even remember reading some of his stories back in the day.
Well, quite possibly. It's a thing that a lot of people tell me that, oh, my grandparents had a stack of Zane Grey books on the shelf, or I used to visit my uncle in the bush and they were there, or when they went perhaps as kids to holiday houses. So there's definitely a bunch of Zane Grey books still floating around out there somewhere. And I hope people very much enjoy this one.
Thanks so much for bringing Zane Grey alive for us today, Vicky. He was an author, of course, but he himself is a great story.
Thank you, Terri. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks.
Hi, Terri back again. I really hope you enjoyed that episode of the R.M.Williams Outback podcast. So we can continue to do what we do, please hit the plus button and subscribe to the free podcast so you'll know when new episodes drop. Oh, and please tell a friend who you think might like it. We'd also love to welcome you to the Outback magazine family, so grab a copy every second month at your local newsagents or contact us directly and we'll have the latest edition sent to you anywhere in Australia with free postage. As I said at the outset, it's all at outbackmag.com.au. Don't be a stranger, get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.